Kia ora everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Hidden Dragons, New Zealand perspective on Vietnam. A very, very warm welcome to everyone, particularly to our participants. Tēnā koutou katoa, ako hoa mahe no te whare wananga nei. Me mihi ki te mana whenua, ki a ngai tua huririri katika. No ruhia au ko Urals nā maunga, ko I sete awa. He pukenga au I te tari whakahaere, whakatairanga me te raka hinanga. He kaimahi au I te whare wananga o Waitaha, ko ana ul tako ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A warm welcome to everybody. I wanted to thank our panelists for joining us from all over the world with the time difference, so welcome. And I will now pass to Susanna Jessup.
Thank you very much. My name is Susanna Jessup. I'm the Director of Research and Engagement at the Asia New Zealand Foundation, an organisation dedicated to helping New Zealanders thrive in Asia. And we're really pleased to be partnering with the University of Canterbury Business School for this webinar. I think today is going to be a particularly interesting discussion. So last month we released new research on Vietnam, and I'm not going to steal the thunder of the panellists, who I'm sure in due course will tell you why we should all get on a plane to Vietnam as soon as borders open. But I would like to start with sharing one headline statistic to help frame today's discussion, and that's if you walked out onto the streets of New Zealand today, statistically, just under half of all adult New Zealanders will say they self-identify as knowing little to nothing about Asia. And that's quite a stunning statistic for a region that represents 7 out of 10 of our top 10 trading partners, is the most populous region in the world, is the region that is growing fastest, and will be the region that undoubtedly has the biggest impact on New Zealand's future security and prosperity. So today's discussion helps basically challenge that statistic. It's a chance to share knowledge, share insights, and basically shine a light on a part of Asia where there are tremendous opportunities for New Zealand. And while borders are closed, we have an opportunity to do our homework and to share the, ideas so that when borders are open, we're ready to go. So thank you very much to the University of Canterbury Business School for pulling us together for this important discussion. Thank you to the panellists today, including to Hihiko Manning, the author of our recent research. And thank you to everyone tuned in. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, Susanna. Thank you very much for this warm welcome. So I will introduce our panellists now. We have Warwick Klein, Warwick is a chairman and a CEO of KPMG in Vietnam and Cambodia, and a managing partner of the firm's deals, tax and legal practices. Warwick also serves as an adjunct industry professor for RMIT University in the School of Business and Management. Warwick is recognized as one of Southeast Asia's leading corporate advisors and is frequent speaker and writer on Asia-Pacific business and economics affairs. Warwick also serves on KPMG's Asia-Pacific board and the Global Council of KPMG International. Our second panelist is Linh Nguyen. Linh is an author, a political risk analyst, and a lead analyst in Southeast Asia. Our third panelist is Hihiko Manning. Hihiko is a former New Zealand ambassador to Vietnam and founder and managing director of Light Path Consulting Group, which is based in Ho Chi Minh City. So welcome, panelists. I think, as Susanna mentioned, this is a very, very interesting topic. You know, from the Asia New Zealand Foundation research report, we know that the history between New Zealand and Vietnam is very, very strong. We know that we are culturally, also and historically, have a very, very well developed and nurtured relationship. So the first question that I'd like to put out for discussion is, how is New Zealand perceived and characterized in Vietnam by consumers and businesses? And do we need to focus on an image upgrade in any areas? So Ling, we'll start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure, thank you, Anna. Well, I think an honest answer could be Vietnamese consumer and businesses as well. I think New Zealand is an obscure image of a faraway agricultural island, very closely linked to Australia in terms of geography, culture, people, policy. Although we can debate about that, but I'm just talking from perspective of a Vietnamese consumer here. So there are many myths about New Zealand that need to be broken in Vietnam, and that's where the opportunities is for businesses. For example, let's talk about New Zealand agricultural products, which are perceived as like one of the best in the world, but is New Zealand beef as popular as those from Australia or US or Japan in Vietnam? I don't think so. Or which technologies and materials that those biggest dairy companies in Vietnam use? They are from Israel, US, Australia. I don't think New Zealand is in that top list. Or education. We all know that New Zealand education system is world class. But when you ask Vietnamese parents, the top destination where they wanted to send their children to, there's no New Zealand in that. I'm sure Hihiko can add a lot more into this. So to your second part of the question, how can we upgrade your image in Vietnam? I think one good example is rocket apple. I'm sure that you all know that. As you know, in Vietnam, the growth rate of Vietnamese middle class is one of the fastest in the world. Mm-hmm. And they love experience new expensive products. But for example, a majority of them still think Gala apple is from Australia or from US. Not many of them know that it's originally from New Zealand. But since rocket apple entered Vietnam market last year or earlier this year, I think, it's a lot more expensive than Gala apple. But they have branded themselves very well with the image of tiny cutie apple, high nutrition. So although both products I think are very good, excellent quality, but which product Vietnamese consumer remember more? I think you got the answer.
Thank you very much, Ling, for this insight, for sharing your insights and wisdom with us. Hihiko, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I agree with that. I think that often in New Zealand, I mean, New Zealand produces amazing products and really high quality products, and we tend to sort of get into our own little echo chamber and think that they'll sell themselves, or that everyone will just instantly see the quality of what we're producing. But actually, there's a lot of work that needs to go into building brand awareness and understanding of what New Zealand has to offer. When I was somebody in the past, when I was the New Zealand ambassador, at that time, I used to talk a lot about New Zealand, obviously, and the sentiment generally towards New Zealand was really positive, but it kind of petered out pretty quickly. So people would be like associating New Zealand with, say, dairy products, maybe with fruit like apples and things like that. But after that, the association sort of died away reasonably quickly. And I think the challenge for us is to, really look at how we can broaden that and, you know, to a range of other things that New Zealand does very, very well beyond just dairy and apples.
Okay, thank you very much, Hihiko. Warwick, what is your opinion on this?
Oh, I mean, I think Lynn and Hihiko have summed it up very well. There's which I mean, we'll come to later in the discussion. But the good news from what both of them have said is that there's a huge amount of potential, right? That we can both deepen the relationship and the perception of New Zealand and Vietnam, and we can broaden the number of goods and services that we're selling here. So there's a huge potential to make a lot more of this, which I know we're going to delve into.
Absolutely, and I think the report covers a lot of it in terms of our agricultural lane, like what you've mentioned, and also in terms of education and how we can bring history to create to create the culture, the collaborative culture between the two nations. So what are 3 key messages that New Zealand businesses should take away from the Asia New Zealand Foundation research report regarding future Vietnam opportunities? So you've mentioned a little bit about that there are opportunities. What are these opportunities? So Hihiko, we will start with you, and I just would like to point out that Hihiko wrote the report, so we are very fortunate to have you comment on this. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So in terms of the messages, I guess I'd like to emphasise for New Zealand business that come out of the report, and also more generally. I mean, I think the first thing is that a lot of Kiwis and other people around the world, a lot of their perceptions about what Vietnam is and what it's becoming need a little bit of updating, I think. You know, I think for a long time we've associated Vietnam with, you know, those beautiful picturesque images of, you know, beautiful Vietnamese women riding bicycles through rice paddies wearing cone hats. And that is, of course, still part of the allure of this country. But actually, these days, it's a very different place, and it's an increasingly sophisticated and savvy place. Incredibly well connected digitally and otherwise. And just to give you maybe one little anecdote from my experience here. So 4 years ago, I went up to the mountains in the north of Vietnam, and I decided I'd go out there and do a hike. And so I hired a local guide who was from the ethnic minorities, from the Hmong ethnic minority. And I said to her, okay, you know, I'm only here for a few days. I want you to work me really hard. So let's do a really tough trek. She's like, sure, no problem. And so off we went up the closest mountain, which was super steep. She left me in the dust, and I was like, you know, sort of sweating way behind her. And I finally got to the top of the mountain where she had clearly been sitting there for about half an hour. And I, you know, sort of collapsed next to her, and I said, oh, what are you up to? And she had 2 phones out. And I said, what are you doing? And she's like, well, I'm trading my watermelons in the market with the first phone. I said, well, what about the second phone? Oh, I'm watching Hmong movies that are made in California just while I was waiting for you. And this is, you know, an example of, you know, someone sitting in the mountains, you know, in northern Vietnam, who is now connected to the world and is digitally savvy and is trading online. And I think that's the kind of image that we need to sort of really update ourselves with, that this country is increasingly sophisticated and will be a growing force, both economically and politically in the region to come in the future. The second thing I wanted to say in terms of key messages for business, aside from the fact that Vietnam is changing and we need to update our perceptions, the second thing would be that actually the nature of the opportunities is changing for New Zealand as well. So I think we need to look beyond the traditional sense of, oh, we can spruik or trade some things here, we can sell some apples or some dairy to Vietnam. In fact, beyond that trading relationship, which is really important, Vietnam is going to become much more important as in supply chains. And so in terms of where New Zealand companies that are involved in global supply chains will be producing or providing their inputs to. So for example, if you look at
Thank you, Hihiko. I think there are a few really important points that you brought up. Vietnam it's shifting, it's entering this global arena where it's becoming a very, very sophisticated and very well-developed emerging market. If we look before at emerging markets, which markets we talked about China, Russia, Brazil, and India. So now I think we're really shifting our thinking that it's not simply a market where you export and where you bring your goods to, but it's, like you said, it's hub for development of goods and services. And the thinking should be towards more value adding as opposed to simple commodity trading. So thank you for that, Hihiko. Warwick, what key messages that New Zealand businesses should take away from the report?
Oh, I think certainly the point on updating knowledge is really important that Hihiko made. I mean, and a good start would be to read the report. I mean, there is a really outdated view of Vietnam and of the opportunities, and I think to your point, Anna, there a lot of New Zealand exporters have thought exporting means China or exporting means Australia, and there's so much more opportunity out there. So yeah, that'd be my view. Just get up to date, and participating in this is obviously a great start, and reading the report would be a great way to do that.
Thank you very much, Warwick. Just a quick note that there is the report. The link to the report is posted into the chat. So to our participants, please make sure that you download it. So Lynn, what is your view on the key messages?
I absolutely agree with Hihiko and Warwick. But if you ask me, because my everyday job is a risk consultant, I not only help clients identify opportunities, but also identify risks that they might face if they enter Vietnam market. So I look at the issue more like from the risk perspective. And I think, yes, obviously opportunities are huge in Vietnam, it's undeniable, but also there are risks that the companies and investors should bear in mind, like the short-term risks, because as you might know, Vietnam is going to have the leadership changes next year. So what does that mean to their business? Like those already there or those might enter, could they change any policy that could affect your sector, your business next year? Could they have the new minister who might be more liberal or more conservative that like could make more difficulties or easier to your business? That's like short-term issue that you should keep in mind. Longer risks that we normally analyze is that like, is corruption in Vietnam still as serious as people talk like 10 years ago? Do we still have to bribe government officer or like petty corruption? How's the situation now in Vietnam on that issue? Or like, as you might remember, like 8 years ago, Vietnam faced a huge economic crisis with like 20% inflation and huge bad debt in banking system and SOEs. So is this problem still there? Have they already solved this? Have they like already cleaned up the banking system that we can now comfortably enter the market? That's where I think you should keep in mind as well.
Lynn, I think this is a really, really important important point that you made, which is linked to Warwick's point about, and also Heike's, your point about, you know, it's knowing what entry strategies you are going to use, you're going to employ. It's generating knowledge about the institutional environment of Vietnam. And having those nuanced knowledges, Lynn, that you were talking about, you know, the corruption, the informal connections, the formal rules and regulations that exist in Vietnam. So I think thank you very much for sharing it. I think there are some very good messages that New Zealand businesses can learn from. The third question that we would like to discuss is, what are the Vietnamese government's macroeconomic and trade strategies for the medium-long term? Are there future directions that New Zealand business should be aware of? Warwick, we will start with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. I mean, this is we spend a lot of time working with clients on this topic, really, and you know, more than ever before, geopolitics is in the boardroom these days, and people are thinking about exactly that sort of policy direction of countries, where they're sitting in the world, what is driving the domestic reform agendas, and so on. I think for Vietnam, there's three things come to mind. The first is that this is a growing country and a growing economy, and even this year, the COVID year, where a lot of the world is tipping into recession and negative GDP growth, including New Zealand, Vietnam is one of only 2 countries in Asia that is going to record positive economic growth, and it's a really high priority for the government over the long term. Ever since the reform program began, probably in the early 1990s, Vietnam's recorded positive economic growth. Vietnamese people's incomes have grown, they've become more prosperous, their spending power's grown, and this creates a huge opportunity. And part of the driver for that national imperative is the demographic situation. Vietnam's really, really young. Everybody's 23, as if you look out there, apart from me and Heike. And that creates a real social dynamic and an economic dynamic, which is very compelling for countries like New Zealand that produce things that young families want and that growing economies want. So that need to keep growing to keep people employed. There's sort of 1 million people entering the workforce every year. GDP growth's got to be at sort of 4, 5, 6% to soak them up. That just drives a lot of government direction around growth. The second big driver, I think, is the desire of the government to integrate. So Vietnam is with the global economy. And Vietnam's a really major exporting power now. Over 100% of GDP value of exports, 200% of trade. So that is driving also a lot of government policy and thinking as well, is the need to maintain the Vietnam export machine. And it's derived from commodities. Vietnam exports a lot of agricultural commodities like New Zealand does, but different ones, coffee, pepper, seafood, and so on. but increasingly driven by manufactured goods, textiles, electronics, and what have you. So this driver for or the importance of the export economy is something that drives a lot of Vietnam's policy, including the really active program that the government has around executing trade deals. So Vietnam was a founding signatory with New Zealand on the CPTPP, active in the ASEAN economic community, just signed up to the RCEP agreements, concluded this year a free trade agreement with the EU, one of only 2 countries in Southeast Asia to have an agreement with the EU. Will in the next few weeks probably do a trade agreement with the UK. And important trading relationships in Asia with Japan, Korea, and what have you. So this government has been really active at that program, and what it means when they sign trade agreements is it reinforces the domestic reform agenda as well, and because they need to meet, particularly under agreements like the CPTPP, need to meet environmental standards, employment conditions, and what have you, in order to participate. Same with the EU FTA. So a perpetual reform program, a young country, and a real desire to integrate are the sorts of things that New Zealand companies need to know, that you're coming into a country which really represents, because of its demographics, the future of this part of the world. It's going to be a increasingly more important player in Southeast Asia, and it's also a friend of New Zealand as well. And when I come back to geopolitics, the world is an interesting place geopolitically at the moment, with different alliances and the rise of trade nationalism and what have you. Vietnam and New Zealand are tied together through agreements like the CPTPP and the New Zealand agreements with ASEAN and so on, that make New Zealand a friend of Vietnam. So a good place and a good starting point for companies that are looking to establish business here.
Thank you very much, Warwick. Lynn, what is your view on this?
I absolutely agree with Warwick. The only one point I wanted to add is that in terms of macro perspective, I think the key important point that makes Vietnam stand out from its peers in Southeast Asia is political stability. At least in the past couple of years, as we see, you don't see like political turbulence in Vietnam like you see in Thailand or Indonesia during past 2 years. You don't see like religions issues in Vietnam like you see in Myanmar with the Rohingya, or in Indonesia with the Muslim issues in Jakarta. So you can rest assured that if you enter Vietnam, if you have investment in Vietnam, you don't have to see those issues that could like significantly affect your business. And also, I don't see things could change in terms of the political stability in Vietnam, at least in the next 10 or 20 years, because it's pretty certain that Vietnam government still wanted to keep such environment. That's like where it can attract more investment.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. Hihiko, over to you now.
Oh yeah, I agree with all that. I think Lynn's point around political stability, I think it's a really good one, and it is something that really helps Vietnam stand out in the region. I think, as she mentioned earlier, there's going to be a shifting of the chairs in Hanoi in January, the 5-yearly Party Congress. But we don't, and certainly I wouldn't see that as having any major impact on the overall direction of the country that Warwick outlined as well, in terms of what they're trying to do. I think, just to kind of put it in perspective a little bit in terms of the growth story here, the growth story here is incredibly compelling. And obviously, Vietnam, until recently and even today remains, on a per capita basis, not hugely wealthy. But you look at the trajectory of this country, it's astonishing. You look back over the past 25 years, everyone talks about China. Well, right behind China, number 2 in the world in terms of growth over the last quarter century has been Vietnam. And if you look forward through to 2050, again, depending on which consulting firms you talk to, especially the high quality ones like PwC, they will tell you that through to 2050, Vietnam is going to be one of the top three economies probably globally in terms of its growth prospects. The drive here is unbelievable. The energy here is unbelievable. It's just this relentless search for prosperity for its people, and that is really, really compelling. And it's part of the reason, I think, why we're all here and why we believe that New Zealand should be looking more closely at Vietnam.
Absolutely. I think the political stability is really, really important. And New Zealand businesses, they're used to it in New Zealand because we have quite a sophisticated and stable political environment. So I think in that respect, that closeness, that it kind of reduces the liability of foreigners between the countries, which is great for New Zealand businesses. And also, Warwick, your point about New Zealand and in terms of geopolitics, and that New Zealand and Vietnam are friends. So in today's environment, with the COVID, we see the geopolitics intensified significantly between different countries. So I think nurturing the friendship that we have and for businesses to realize it and understand it for New Zealand businesses is important. So thank you for sharing that. So there is a line that the winner of the US-China trade war is Vietnam. But jokes aside, is this a broadly accurate summary? Lynn, we'll start with you on that.
Thank you. Well, that's the question actually I've been asked every day by my clients during past 12 months. Is the story that Vietnam's the biggest winner from the trade war real? Should we move to Vietnam now? Should we ship everything to Vietnam now? Yeah, I have to answer that every day. And I could say the answer is yes, in the short term. And we see data points already prove that. Like, for example, last year and also this year, import from China to Vietnam increased significantly, and export from Vietnam to US also grew like around 20% compared to previous years. So another example is also, I know that, for example, land price in industrial zones has jumped significantly. One of my friends asked me to co-invest in industrial land assets last year, and the price just went double just after 6 months. And also you see some other indications like Apple is announced that they're going to build the first factory in Vietnam. Many other big international companies also moving to Vietnam. So yeah, it's obviously Vietnam is benefiting, somewhat benefiting from the trade war. But that's a short-term story. In the long term, I'm less optimistic about that. There's a couple of reasons. Number one, Vietnam has been relying too much on the supply chains from China. It's not a separate manufacturing base from China. You even can say that it's like an expansion of Guangdong province. So I don't think that Vietnam manufacturing can survive for the long run if Chinese manufacturer had to close down. The second reason is China will soon also take some action to prevent Vietnam from taking all the benefit. For example, I've been working on some investigation and research about the transshipment issue from Chinese company in Vietnam. Like some Chinese company, they just take Vietnam as a docking station to transfer their products from made in China to made in Vietnam and then ship them to the US. And that issue is like raising in Vietnam. Last reason is the US also will impose some measures sooner or later. As you remember, last year, Trump called Vietnam the single worst abuser of everyone. The US strategy also put Vietnam in its latest currency manipulators watch list. Although Biden's government might change that, but that won't happen soon. And regardless of that, I think the story won't be very easy for Vietnam in the long future.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Hihiko, what is your view on this?
I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with Lynn, certainly in terms of the short term and the immediate. The sort of the current sort of glow around Vietnam is quite bright, and I think, you know, with you know, announcements from sort of globally recognised brands like Apple, you know, who with their partners Foxconn are looking to set up here. Those are things that show that, you know, Vietnam is very much in the spotlight these days, as indeed does the attention of the US government, as Lynn mentioned, you know, with the currency manipulation investigations into timber shipments as well from Vietnam. It's almost like a coming of age, like Vietnam is now worthy of the global attention. And longer term, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that I would probably tend to be a little bit more positive on the longer term than Lynn is suggesting. That, you know, for the next 10 to 15 years at least anyway, that growth story, even in manufacturing and particularly services, will continue for Vietnam. But I do defer to her expertise because it's something she looks at every day.
Thank you very much, Hihiko. Warwick, what is your view?
Yeah, it's a great discussion point in Vietnam, and certainly we at KPMG have done a lot of work in helping companies into the Vietnam market shift manufacturing capacity from China to Vietnam, particularly to access the US market in textiles, electronics, and those sorts of things. But it's a truism that Trump was not elected to make Vietnam great again originally, right? So his increasing rhetoric, and indeed, as Lynn mentioned, those steps in the last few months have been targeted at Vietnam's trade surplus with the US. So that you know, that administration hasn't liked that at all. I think Biden's election is a really good thing, good news for Vietnam and for trading countries. Vietnam is just like New Zealand, a small export country, small country heavily reliant on exports that really relies on multilateralism and the rule of law. So to the same extent New Zealand looks positively on that from its trading perspective and place in the world, Vietnam is exactly the same. So we ought to see a return to a more balanced view of the world and in the trade environment, and Vietnam will be good for that. I'm also bullish on the long term. I think Lynn's making a very good point on Vietnam's integration into Chinese supply chains, and but nobody's predicting the demise of Chinese manufacturing, and I think that Vietnam's going to continue to play a big role in those supply chains, and a growing one in its own right. And apart from anything else, the labour cost arbitrage for labour-intensive manufacturing is going to remain in place for quite a while, and Vietnamese labour is a cost around a third to a quarter of Chinese labourers at the moment in factories. So that's a big difference. So the labour-intensive manufacturing is good. And notwithstanding the small fortune that Lynn gave up on her industrial zone property play by not seeing an opportunity last year, even things like, you know, industrial property and other inputs are pretty good for manufacturers. So it ought to be a pretty good long-term play. And the geopolitical thing. You know, the tension on Chinese trade is not going away from Europe, from the United States and others, and everybody is talking about diversification of their trade story, and Vietnam is extraordinarily well placed in those sort of reorganization of where who countries are trading with.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Warwick. Some really very important points to think about for New Zealand businesses. And it seems like the future is going to be okay for Vietnam, but of course it's, and Vietnam has been in the report, Hihiko, where you outlined that Vietnam has been doing fantastic in response to COVID and exporting essential goods to countries like US and like China. So I think there is a lot of important information and points that you've raised. What new and changing consumer trends are you observing in Vietnam, including in the wake of COVID-19? So Hihiko, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think probably the first thing I would say is that what I'm seeing, and I've lived here now for 8 years, which is less than I think the other two panelists have. But during that time, what I've noticed is an increasing level of sophistication amongst Vietnamese consumers. I think probably once upon a time, in the early days, imported products were kind of accepted without question and they were sort of prized somehow. These days, I think, you're seeing Vietnamese consumers become much more discerning. And while you still have a lot of price sensitivity in the market, I think there is also a segment of the population now that's really ready to pay for quality, safe products. Particularly in food and healthcare, which is, sort of areas of real strength for New Zealand. So the increasing sophistication of the Vietnamese consumer, I think, would be the first point that I would note. You need to have some serious money to afford those rocket apples that Lynn was talking about earlier. I mean, they for our New Zealand audience, I think they retail for about $10 for like 3-4 measly little apples, which taste great. But it's
$3 each.
It's quite pricey. I would, anyway, I shouldn't say I would never buy them. That wouldn't be patriotic. But anyway.
You shouldn't say that small and measly, Hihiko. That's, you're not in charge of Apple marketing anymore.
Okay. All right, I've lost my sidekick. Never mind. So the first thing is around sophistication. I think the second thing is around the rise of e-commerce. And of course, this is something that we're seeing around the world to varying degrees. But, the average Vietnamese consumer and the sophisticated urban consumer in that demographic that everyone is targeting is very digitally enabled these days. And, in terms of reaching your market, if you're looking to sell into Vietnam, I think really being aware of that, being aware of how products are traded and how they're sold and how they're distributed, and the role of e-commerce in that is super important. So, the traditional way of doing things, which is, you find a distributor or an importer and you sell your 2 containers of, let's use apples again, to them, and then you lose track of what happens. You get no feedback from the consumer. I think those days are gone, and I think there's going to be a real need for, in particular for New Zealand producers and traders to be much closer to the market. And the good news is that, with technology and with digital platforms these days, you can be. And you can engage directly with the consumer. You can control much better, the journey of your product into the consumer's hands and get that feedback. And I think that's another really important trend. The third one I just want to mention briefly, and sort of wearing my current hat, my education hat, is I think, obviously, with COVID across the world, the mode of delivery of education has changed quite a lot. And what we're seeing here in Vietnam is, as a result of that, a whole new, or an acceleration of acceptance of online or blended learning as a potential solution for education. I don't want to overstate that and say everyone's going online and will consume all their education online. That's unrealistic. But in terms of the way in which the market is shifting and the way in which people are thinking about how they consume their goods and services, again, education's a good example of the rapid changes in this market. And for New Zealand, again, and New Zealand education providers or companies, they really need to be thinking about that, because they think in traditional ways, they're going to be left behind.
Thank you very much, Hihiko. Warwick, what do you think?
Yeah, I echo everything like Hihiko just said. I would add just really for the record, because the question was framed in the context of COVID and how that might have influenced consumer behaviour and so on. Vietnam is like New Zealand for all intents and purposes COVID free. So there hasn't been a massive lockdown here consumer society is largely continued unabated. The shopping malls are full, the resorts are full, people are flying around the country, driving around restaurants and bars and so on. So that's sort of, to the extent, a real acceleration of digital commerce in the heavily affected areas in Europe and the United States and so on. Vietnam is much more like New Zealand in the sense that people did certainly rapidly adopt technology, particularly in the business environment. But consumers, I think it's been a long-term trend. The things Heike's describing around internet usage and mobile internet usage in particular have been really, really strong statistics in Vietnam for a long time, probably because everybody is 23, as I said earlier. And you know, the COVID has accelerated, but no, it's not been a game changer in the sense that it has in some markets.
Okay, thank you very much, Warwick. Lynn, do you have anything to add?
Well, the gentleman just summarized perfectly, and I really agree with the points about e-commerce. Like, as you know, Vietnamese people, they know for being hardworking and creative. If, for example, one thing doesn't work out, then they move to a different idea. Like if they lose their job, then they might sell Apple online, something like that. So e-commerce is very important point during COVID. And education, yes. At least 70 or 80% of people in my circle that I know that they decided to send their children to study in international school at home rather than study in US or UK. So having a New Zealand international school in Vietnam might be an idea in the near future. Or they might send their children to somewhere safer, like the safest countries like New Zealand rather than US or other countries. So yeah, that's the point. I just, one new point I wanted to add is looking at bigger pictures of the government perspective during and after COVID. My experience from talking to them is that they are a lot more open and easier to approach than before COVID, because they are now all under pressure of boosting the economic growth. I feel like they are more welcome for investment into the countries. And I also predict that they might loosen some policies like restriction in terms of investment in the country. So yeah, the door is open for you guys.
Thank you very much. We have, all of you mentioned education. So we have a question from the participants around education. So New Zealand universities are far behind their counterparts from US, Canada, UK, and Australia in terms of building their brands in Vietnam. Although Ambassador Wendy Matthews has been working hard to change the perception about New Zealand education, I don't see much impact so far. How would you help to change that?
Mark?
Heiko, this is definitely one for you.
Yeah, look, I think you know, part of the challenge for New Zealand in terms of education has been that we have kind of taken until now quite a transactional approach to the market. And so in terms of the way in which we promote New Zealand and the way in which New Zealand institutions promote their education services here, it's kind of fly in, fly out. And there hasn't really been the investment into building partnerships or even potentially bricks and mortar operations here in Vietnam. And that's in contrast to what you see, particularly with the Australians. And I need to tip my hat to the Australians here because I reckon they're about 10 years ahead of New Zealand in terms of education here and in terms of their brand, maybe even more, 10, 15 years. But I don't think all is lost. I think, as Lynn was saying before, I think that, you know, in terms of the New Zealand brand, I think that the New Zealand brand, especially for education, has been burnished and has been further supported through this current crisis. And I think you'll have more families looking at New Zealand in future. What I think is going to be the key, though, is we're going to need to see more investment and engagement here by the New Zealand education sector. And we are starting to see that with a number of New Zealand universities for the first time actually putting in country representatives, which is a good first step. You know, we're certainly, as my company and as Lightpath, we're certainly very happy to help and to support and even potentially to co-invest with New Zealand education providers that do want to look at this market.
Thank you very much, Hihiko. We have a few more questions from the participants. What are the roles and responsibilities of young Vietnamese people to optimize this massive and recent growth? So, Lynn, perhaps you would want to.
Well, it's a very big question, and I don't think anyone could have a full and short answer for that. I consider myself as young Vietnamese. I think that looking at my generation and my parents' generation, there's like the huge progress in terms of the perspective and ambitions, how they can help contribute to the country's economic growth and also to their own personally. I think one thing you can look at it from different perspectives. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But in this case, it's very good. Is that the nationalism inside Vietnamese, young Vietnamese people are very large, very strong. Obviously you read and see the anti-Chinese movement in Vietnam, and that's like mostly led by young Vietnamese. That doesn't mean that they're going to anti foreign products or foreign elements, but that's also mean that they wanted to contribute themselves to the best that they can build up their own countries, and then make Vietnam like stand higher in the global rankings in terms of like not only economic growth but also other cultures and other perspectives as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Warwick, do you have anything to add to this question?
No, you know, we employ around 1,800 people in Vietnam, and you know the talent that's in this country is huge, and I think you know you can feel the energy and you can feel the abilities that are resonant there, and I wouldn't have any fear that the young people in Vietnam will not make the absolute most of the opportunities before them and really create this big opportunity.
Okay. Hihiko.
Well, I totally agree. I don't employ 1,800 people yet. Hopefully after this call I will be. But you know, the talent and the drive of young Vietnamese people is astonishing, and it's really it's quite humbling to be around. And you know, everyone's just working and pushing all the angles all the time. It's super impressive. And it's really exciting to be a part of, and that's why I really encourage, you know, New Zealanders and New Zealand business to come and take a look and to come and feel what it feels like. It's really infectious what's happening here, and it is being driven by the new generation, the young generation.
That's wonderful, thank you. We have another question. What is the field for market opportunities for New Zealand walnuts and walnut products in Vietnam? It's a very specific question.
Work?
Warwick?
I look like a walnut expert. Yes, I would. Look, I don't know that specifically for the nut industry. I would say Vietnam does produce a lot of nuts, though. I'm not sure about walnuts.
Yeah. Can I just maybe add that I would say this would be a great question to direct to your local NZTE office here in Ho Chi Minh City, and really just a shout out to both the embassy and the consulate team here in Vietnam. You know, they're really well set up, bunch of very, very dedicated individuals, and NZTE in particular is here to support businesses to explore opportunities, whatever they might be, including in walnuts.
Okay. Lynn, do you have any knowledge or anything to add to answer this question?
Well, honestly, I'm not a walnuts expert, but I could look at that from the consumer perspective. And back to my story about the middle class people in Vietnam. I assume that I think walnuts is a lot more expensive than peanuts or cashew in Vietnam. And I remember that like a couple of years ago, the pistachios was very popular in Vietnam, like rich or middle income families. When you visit their family during Tet, like the Lunar New Year, they always like present you something like strain, and pistachios was something like very new to the market at that time. And during past 1 or 2 years, I start seeing walnuts during Tet or like visiting people, and then they present you, yeah, this is imported products, and you cannot find it very popular in the market. So the answer is, yeah, the market is there. Obviously, it's like a lot for you to practice, but how can you enter that? I'm sorry that I'm not a walnuts expert.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've got last question from the audience. What are your views on the development of supporting industries in Vietnam for Vietnamese companies to benefit from CPTPP and EU FTA? Local or member countries' content is important. Do you see government has master plan in developing the supporting industries? How quickly can it catch up with the manufacturing shift from China? I think I think over this this webinar, you've touched on some of the aspects, but what can you say to this question to our participant? Warwick, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll make a couple of observations. Firstly, the sort of trade agreements Vietnam's entering into, particularly CPTPP and the EU FTA, are next generation trade agreements that do put a lot more obligations on Vietnam to develop a deeper ecosystem around manufacturing, particularly to meet country of origin requirements. So that's the first thing. So there is a need for Vietnam to develop supporting industries in order to benefit from the trade agreements that it's signing up to. The second thing is that Vietnam is a one-party state, a planned economy to some extent, and there is a lot of national planning and strategizing, and they have industrial strategies and plans. So when they sign up to a trade agreement which says we need to establish supporting industries to benefit from an FTA, the government and industry then swings behind that concept and makes sure that happens. So you'll have alignment around the provision of infrastructure, industrial land, tax incentives, and so on, to encourage those those supporting industries to develop. So, for example, textiles supporting the development of garments, and so on. And third point I'll make is that a lot of supporting industry ownership and investment in China is actually owned by relatively small business owners or family companies from places like Taiwan and Korea. And you've seen a real surge in investment from those places as well, as those companies look to follow the lead of the source makers. So you see big manufacturing ecosystems coming up around Samsung's mobile phone factory, all the packaging makers and the component makers around that, and the automotive sector the same, garments and textiles the same. So yeah, I think we will see a real rapid acceleration in the development of support industries, and that is coming through, as Lynn said earlier, in the statistics, FDI, and the export numbers as well. So I'd be upbeat on that sector.
Okay, thank you very much, Warwick. Lynn, do you have anything to add to Warwick's answer?
Yes, just very short. I think that Vietnamese government, they are well aware of the opportunities, also challenge of the trade path. They well aware that they cannot benefit a lot from that if they don't improve internally in terms of the worker skill, in terms of the manufacturing qualities. So we all have the good talents in the government. For example, they already implied strategy for improving educational training for skilled worker. Also, the government been talking a lot about applying technologies in everything from administrative to manufacturing. Like if you talk to any government officer, they mention the technology revolution 4.0 many times. So they all aware of what need to do and what challenge they are facing. The reason that this thing will take time, it's not going to happen overnight, is that because the Vietnamese government is a huge bureaucratic system. it's not just like one person making decisions in that. So it's going to take time, but I'm optimistic about that.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Heike, do you have any final comments on this question?
Sure, just really to, I guess, sort of zoom back for a minute and sort of take a broader lens on this. I think, you know, the Vietnamese government understands very well that its future prosperity and the prosperity of its citizens really depends on integrating with the world, connecting with the world through these FTAs and through other agreements. You know, I would say it's probably, after Singapore, probably the most connected country in the region. And so they will be looking at how they can support that and support their industries to really maximise the benefit for Vietnam.
Okay, thank you very much. I again would like to sincerely thank you for joining us and for sharing your wisdom on how New Zealand businesses could operate in Vietnam. I would also like to thank the participants for your engagement and for your questions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.